Arafat?
Arafat is just another one of them. Exactly. He's the weakest in that chain, but he belongs to that same line.
Would you use the same term you used about Bandar?
Oh, yes.
Traitor?
Yeah, but Arafat doesn't have the finances to throw around the types of crimes and the types of massacres that Bandar has his hands in. I think if Arafat was given the same finances, the same potential, the same resources as Bandar has, then he'd probably be playing.
Well, but the whole goal with Arafat, as I understand it, but here, the reason I have you on the program is, correct me if I'm wrong, or the whole idea is to keep Arafat on a short leash. The whole idea is to give him only so much money, only so many guns, and his job is to keep people on the reservation down. And if he doesn't do his job, they'll find someone else.
Yeah, that's right.
But meanwhile, he signs these documents that he admittedly doesn't even understand what they are and hasn't read, and then he is offered a certain amount of guns and a certain amount of money and a certain amount of false promises. And this too goes back to the 1918 period, because I have personally studied that period. The promises that were made at that conference to the Arab leaders, to Emir Faisal, they were all lies. None of the promises were ever fulfilled. And the promises that were made to the Palestinians are totally, I mean, would it be fair to say that the Palestinians are now in the process of being put onto reservations?
Oh, you'd be elevating their status. That they were being put on reservations.
Well, what would you call it?
Well, it's a wicked, and it's a vile, and it's a malicious type of apartheid that the Palestinians right now, it's discrimination as never experienced by human beings that the Palestinians are enduring right now. Arafat, unfortunately, has taken the side. Now, what's the difference? Be a Palestinian for a moment, if you can. What's the difference between Arafat towards the Palestinians and, let's say, a King Hussein towards Palestinians, or Hafez Assad towards Palestinians, or Mubarak towards Palestinians?
Well,
there is no difference.
It's another client regime.
That's right.
But the difference is that this client regime is not even given the trappings of sovereignty. This client regime, the Palestinians having been oppressed for so long, is thrown even smaller scraps. I at least use the phrase they're being put onto reservations. You thought that was being extremely generous to what the Israelis are doing to them.
Absolutely. The type of, especially in the past several months, the type of blockades and curfews and house arrests that have been going on in Gaza and the West Bank, something that the press doesn't want to speak about. The conditions there are terrible, horrendous.
Well, there's no question that the situation for Palestinians in every way, from economically to spiritually to psychologically, is far worse in the aftermath of the Oslo agreements than it was before them. No question about it.
And that is why it's difficult for Arafat to ride the Palestinian people. Because in the case of, let's say, Syrians, Jordanians, Egyptians, just to take the adjacent peoples, in their cases, the rulers have also always been a step ahead, so they know how to tame the following condition. If their people are going to express some type of outrage, they would have that leisure of the time space to prepare for it. Arafat doesn't have that, because the frustration and the anger and the type of pent-up feelings that have been working inside the Palestinian psychology has put Arafat at a disadvantage. He doesn't have that leisure of preparing to remold or mold his constituencies or his people the same way King Hussein can do, although King Hussein's running out of time very quickly, but the same way the other rulers in adjacent areas have been able to do. So Arafat is riding a lion, not like Fahd, who's riding a camel.
You're watching Mideast Realities. This is our weekly program showing on public access channels around the country. We're talking today, I'm your host, I'm Mark Bruzonsky, and we're talking today with Mohamed Alassi. Mohamed has lived in Washington for quite some time. He knows the ins and outs of the Arab American community and of the Islamic community and of the Arab world. He has served as the first and only elected imam of the Washington Mosque here in Washington. And we're now talking about, after having surveyed the Arab world and the Washington scene, we're talking about the so-called peace process in Palestine. You know, it really evolved out of the Gulf War and the Bush administration, don't you think? I mean, they were so worried that the American imposition of itself in the Middle East with military forces for the first we've always been there over the horizon and under the table. But now we were there as a colonizing military force. And they legitimately understood that with the Islamic Revolution and with the Gulf War, this tide you speak of was rising fast. And one of their ways of controlling it was to call the Madrid Conference and say, but we Americans are in the forefront of bringing peace and justice to the Middle East. So you're laughing, but that is the terminology that was used. And then the Palestinians were essentially made naked and penniless and destitute. So when a few bones were thrown in their way, they got Arafat to take on this role. But before they got Arafat to accept this role, they had to strip him down. And they destroyed the PLO. And they destroyed all of the relationships between the PLO and the Arab regimes. And finally, Arafat's choices were to resign and or retire and write a book about how bad things were, or to do what he's done all his career, which was accept the handouts, the money, and the guns from whoever would offer it to him at the time. This time the offer came from his former enemies, the Americans and the Israelis. And it also came at a time when all of the senior PLO personalities had either been assassinated or had been removed in one way or another. So it was just Arafat himself. There were no other major Palestinian personalities to prevent Arafat from doing what he has now done. Now, where do you think this is going? I'm not asking you to be a prophet for 50 years from now. The next 5 or 10 years, where do you think this is going?
I think the whole scenario is developing contrary to the calculations of Israeli, American, and Arab decision makers. They think that they have the whole Middle East turning into a peace process. I think what they are really doing is they are militarizing the Middle East. The grand mistake that Israeli, American, Arab decision and policy makers committed was to pick a fight with this Islamic politicization of the whole area. That's the only way to build it instead of destroy it.
Well, if so, coming out of the American Jewish community as I have, and knowing about the regimes and organizations, this fight was fueled tremendously by the Zionist lobby and by the Israelis. They want this fight. They want the West in this confrontation. Yes.
That's right.
It didn't just happen.
Yeah, you see, from an Israeli Zionist point of view, they needed protection. They see this as a threat concerning them more than it is a threat concerning someone who's living in California or someone who's living in Montana. Obviously, they are living in the Middle East, and they are living in what they themselves call a hostile neighborhood. And so when they see a spark of Islamic self-determination beginning in Iran, and then they see another spark of Islamic determination in North Africa, there's one to the east, one to the west, another one to the south, another one to the north. These sparks, so they feel the most threatened. And what becomes the reaction of a person or people who are in immediate danger? They want to protect themselves by any means possible.
Not only that, but those who remember the history of the Middle East, what the Israelis have done, what they did in Lebanon not all that long ago, are aware that there are forces that will want revenge when and if they ever come to power.
And see, this is the mistake of destiny that the Israeli Zionists have committed. I'm not going to try to pretend that I can psychologically figure this thing out. They came from Europe, they've lived for thousands of years in a hostile diaspora, and they think that the people in the Middle East have to be treated the same way they were treated in Europe to repulse aggression and to protect themselves.
No, you're overlooking, you were very sensitive to the Islamic Revolution and its impact on the Middle East. You overlooked the major factor. In modern history, the Holocaust has left the Jewish psyche terribly scarred and terribly fearful. And it is the predominant psychological matrix by which all decisions and all thinking take place. And in the aftermath of the Holocaust, which of course the irony is, the Jews were quite well treated as minority communities from Iraq to Egypt in the Middle East. It was Christian Europe that perpetrated the Holocaust. And then it was Christian America and Christian Europe that refused to take the survivors of the Holocaust and let them emigrate and go other places, instead dumping them in Islamic Palestine. So the convolutions of this history are tremendous, but do not minimize for a moment the psychological trauma that the Holocaust continues to have on the Jewish psyche and on the nation of a Jewish state. And for all of Israel's excesses and for all of its brutalities, that compared to what the Israelis do to the Palestinians, which is awful, what the Nazis did to the Jews is at another level of magnitude. And in addition to that, the other irony, of course, is that the right wing in Israel behaves with Nazi tendencies and racist slogans and Nazi attitudes without the death camps and without taking it to the conclusion that some of them might take it to if they had power. I mean, you have people serving in this government in Israel who have called the Palestinians cockroaches in bottles. You have grasshoppers in the field. You have people serving as ministers in this government who are war criminals by any standard. So where does one take all this? I asked you to prophesize a bit ahead, and you didn't quite get to the details, but you were suggesting upheaval.
Yes, because you see, the Zionist Israelis should be the first ones to understand that if a people are going to be threatened at the existential level, just as they were threatened in Europe, the Holocaust, the pogroms, etc., then they're going to revert to militarization. They were threatened in Europe, they reverted to the Israeli Zionist bunker mentality. Now, if they do this to Palestinians, to Arabs, they threaten them on the existential level.
Which is exactly why Peres and Rabin decided to talk a different game while doing about the same thing.
And which is why the Israeli public did not buy into that.
And they lost credibility.
And right now, they're just inviting more tension. They're inviting more trouble for the future. The Middle East is going to stay there. They're not going to annihilate 250 million Arabs. No one's going to annihilate them.
We've had other programs about nuclear war in the Middle East, and it's not a subject I rule out, but I agree with you. The Israelis are in the midst of a cauldron that they're stirring up. The irony, of course, is I think they probably thought Arafat would get assassinated, and as it was, Rabin got assassinated. And the other irony was that he was assassinated by a right-winger who didn't realize that Rabin was pursuing their ends. He was trying to pretend that the Palestinians were getting something, while in reality Israel would retain control over the entire area. So there are so many convolutions and ironies involved here, but please draw this conclusion out a little bit. We've only got a few more years left in this millennium, so the next 10 years, what do you foresee first in the Arab-Israeli context and then in the larger regional context?
Well, let me put it this way. Like you said, it's very hard to predict, prophesy what will happen, especially in the Middle East. But with a little common sense with relatively limited knowledge as individuals we all are, I would see that the developing events in the Middle East as a whole, before I get to Palestinian-Israeli relations, in the Middle East as a whole is the phasing out of European political influence on people, meaning that the nation-state nationalism attraction is no longer there in the next 5 to 10 years. I would think that would dissipate to a very, very minimal presence. And on the other hand, there is going to be more adherence to the bona fide personality of these people, their own cultures, their own background, history, ideology that comes from who they are. And
not to mention national interest.
National
their
interest,
own interest.
There will be another interpretation. It won't be national interest. It'll probably be the ideological interest, or it would probably be the group solidarity interest. It'll have another word, but that concept...
We in the West would call it that. They would call it something...
They would give it another name because it would have another characterization. But there's a trend, definitely a trend towards that, whether it's in the Jewish context, whether it's in the Muslim context, or whether it's in the Christian context.
And is the manifestation of that the bombs in Arabia, which are designed not so much to kill a few people, but to raise the price of Americans staying there so visibly?
Oh, yes.
That's what this is really all about.
Yeah.
That's what these bombs are about.
That's right.
And that's what the terrorism in Egypt's about.
The American presence in Arabia is the most inviting target, but it's not the only target. I'm sure if there was an Israeli presence, if the Israelis make more of themselves available in the Arabian Peninsula, they would be the prime target. But it so happens that they've been smart enough to keep a low profile if they ever have a presence there so far. But if they build up their presence there, they'd be target number one. And then followed by the United States, because the United States is blindly, right now, an Israeli stooge. Israel says, America does. And then number three, it's the client administrations and the client regimes in the area that are target number three. These will remain the targets, but they will equivocate according to which one here is the most predominant. The Americans are the most predominant Arabian Peninsula, and as long as they remain that way, they will remain target number one.
And in Palestine, between Israel and what's left of the Palestinian community?
Yeah, as far as that relationship is concerned, I think the Palestinian issue is going to fade away as a Palestinian issue. And it's going to gain more of an Islamic issue. It's going to draw in Islamic forces that are going to be militarily opposed to the Zionists. I can't predict very accurately within the Israeli context how that force is going to be, but I would venture and say that it will have more of a religious undertone and more of a religious motivation to it in the future as things are going.
Do you think the Palestinian Authority, the PA, will survive?
Oh, no, definitely not.
Definitely not.
Definitely not.
You don't very often say definitely.
Well, in this one I feel very strong that the Palestinian Authority is not going to survive.
It's a temporary phenomena because its roots and reality were never solid and honest.
That's right, inside its own, the context of its own.
I was going to ask, did you think it would survive Arafat's death? He can't stay forever.
Yeah, it'll survive his death, but for a very short while. It will not survive.
And what will replace it?
It will be replaced by a type, I think, of maybe transitional, a type of administration that will try to present itself as true to Palestinian aspirations, but then on the other side it will want to have some legitimacy So it will combine some Islamic notions into it as a compromise to the Islamic forces that are in the making within the Palestinian context. But that will be a transitional phase, and it will ultimately become an Islamic type of representation of the Palestinian people that is rooted not only in the Palestinian West Bank and Gaza and Jordan, but also rooted in the larger Islamic context that will be meeting this Palestinian problem and tragedy in other areas.
And what of this conflict between Islam and the West? What do you expect? There's bound to be more terrorism, isn't there? There's bound to be more counter-reaction.
I think that as long as the Zionist factor is present in Western civilization, especially in its political and economic quarters, and as long as the Zionist factor is present militarily and politically in the Middle East, this is going to be the source of growing and exacerbating tension between Islam and the West.
Don't you think war with Iran, the destruction of Iranian power and economy, is something this Zionist factor and other segments of our society, the American society, are in fact preparing for?
Yes, I think it's a Zionist priority. I think because it's a Zionist priority, that will draw in the United States. And by extension, it will draw in the Arab officialdom in the Middle East to take the side of Zionism against what the Islamic revolution in Iran stands for. And the Islamic revolution in Iran has its extension, not a very structured one, not a very developed and elaborate one within the Muslim masses throughout the area. So if it does come to blows, it's going to be a very unpredictable scenario.
It's not going to be just like taking on Ba'athist Iraq.
Oh no. You have. Right now, as I said, there's a militarization. People who think that they are eradicating Muslims are actually militarizing Muslims. So you have a militarization of Muslims going on in Central Asia, Chechnya, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, not to speak of Afghanistan for the past decade and a half. Also, you have Kashmir. You have certain parts of Africa right now that are being militarized, especially what is referred to as the Horn of Africa, the Nile Valley. There's a pincer, I think, right now that is closing in on the Israelis, although it's a very nebulous one at this time, but they see it coming. That has two sides to it, an African Islamic side and an Asian Islamic side. And if they feel as they have always felt within that siege mentality of theirs, if they can't break out of that, and if they think the solution is ultimately a nuclear solution, that is the final choice that they are going to make. It's not going to be a very comfortable one for them.
Well, I think they have already made the choice to use nuclear weapons and to use military might as a deterrent against anyone taking them on. That decision's already been made. They have a huge nuclear force.
Yeah, well, that is another way. It's not going to erode this Islamic locomotive that's just picking up speed right now.
Well,
it's not going to erode it.
If we're able to continue Mideast Realities, I hope you, Mohamed Al-Assi, will come back periodically and we can pick up this discussion where we're leaving it. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm Mark Bruzonsky. I'm your host for this program, and for the last couple of weeks we've been discussing in very, I think, thoughtful and very detailed terms the situation in the Middle East, the situation in Washington in dealing with the Middle East. And please tune in next week on this channel, same day, same time, for another Mideast Realities.